The ghostly tome. An old library stood at the edge of town, a structure with stone walls darkened by centuries of weather. Ivy covered the walls, and narrow arched windows allowed only the faintest. This was where Clara worked as the head librarian, a job she had cherished for over a decade. She always found solace in the silence, the smell of old books. But something had changed. Clara arrived early and approached the heavy wooden door. As she unlocked it, a shiver came over her, a feeling she had been experiencing more often lately. She took it as the cold of the morning and went inside. The library was still and silent, as usual at this hour. Clara moved through the familiar aisles, her footsteps echoing softly. She followed her routine, checking book returns and organizing new arrivals. The building's silence was comforting, yet today it felt oppressive, almost watchful. She made her way to the basement, where the rare and old books were stored. It was her favorite part of the library, but for some reason, they were often not taken out for reading. The basement was the coldest part of the library, and as Clara descended the creaky wooden stairs, she felt a growing sense of unease. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls, and the musty smell of old paper was stronger here. She was searching for a book that a researcher had requested from her library. As she searched, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. She quickly turned around, but saw nothing. She told herself it was just a rat. Clara continued her search. Finally, she found the book she was looking for, an old leather-bound tome with faded gold lettering. As she pulled it from the shelf, she felt a sudden, icy breeze brush past her. The lights flickered, and she heard the rustling again, louder this time, as if something was moving through the stacks. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest. She decided it was time to leave the basement. As she turned to go, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, darker than the others, passed between the bookshelves. She stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. A shadow that had the vague shape of a human being. The shadow stopped, forming a vaguely human-like shape that seemed to be looking straight at her, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. She stumbled up the stairs, nearly dropping the book in her haste. Panic struck. Clara struggled to find the flashlight, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't turn it on. The rustling sound grew louder, closer, until she felt it right next to her. Clara felt something cold and wet touch her arm, and she screamed. At that moment, she dropped the book, revealing pages filled with strange, unfamiliar symbols. Reluctantly took the book back, feeling an inexplicable pull to take it with me. In the darkness, as she brought the book upstairs, Clara could feel its presence. It seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with fear. As she neared the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening noise. The library above seemed unchanged, still and silent, but the claustrophobic feeling remained. Back in the main lobby, Clara sat at her desk, a mysterious book in front of her. She placed the book on the table and took a breath, then stared at it with both fear and curiosity. She started to wonder whether she should open it or not, but then she curiously opened it to examine the symbols, flipping through each page, brittle with age. The symbols seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive. She shook her head, blaming her imagination. And thinking she was being paranoid. Darkness filled the library. She suddenly read a passage out loud. Suddenly, the whispering became louder. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. Clara's breathing became rapid. She tried to ignore it, closed the book immediately, and decided to put it back in its place. The library was silent and dark. Clara, she doesn't know if she's in her imagination, or if something is residing in this library, or if there are hidden secrets that she doesn't know yet. Morning light cast long shadows through narrow windows. Clara stood outside, hesitating to enter. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Clara slowly walked toward her desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she passed by, she glimpsed the old book she had stored in the basement yesterday lying on her desk. Clara was horrified. She was certain she'd put it back on the shelf in the basement. Clara stared at the book, hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it, deciding to destroy it in hopes of freeing herself from this fear. She walked toward the old fireplace at the far end of the library, gripping the book tightly. She opened it, and the symbols writhed as if alive, almost resisting her. She threw the book into the flames. A hissing sound escaped from the book. The fire abruptly went out, extinguished, leaving the book charred but still intact. Clara stared at the ancient book, desperate. She raised the book to throw it into the trash. But as she swung her arm, an invisible force pulled it from her hand. The book flew across the room, hovering mid-air. Then it started flying back, hurtling toward her with fierce speed. It slammed into her chest, knocking the wind out of her in pain. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her aching ribs. She held her breath, watching the book fall to the floor, its pages flapping wildly. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the book again, and from the corner of her eye, she sensed someone standing and watching her. At that moment, everything seemed to go dark. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a shadowy figure from her nightmares. She lifted her phone flashlight to see. The figure moved slowly into the faint light, revealing the distorted, grotesque shape of a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. Her face was gaunt, with only skeletal features. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, revealing jagged, decayed teeth. Her eyes were black, hollow, and lifeless. Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand. The grotesque woman moved closer, her jerky movements almost puppet-like. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged toward her, its twisted, skeletal hand stretching out, distorting as it reached for her. Its claw-like fingers scratched across Clara's face, as if devouring a meal. Clara raised the book defensively, trying to fend it off, but the spirit lunged at her again. With its unnaturally elongated arm, it grabbed her shoulder once again, pulling her closer. Pain tore through her, as if her skin was being ripped apart. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The woman's face came closer, her distorted smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing layers of rotting flesh inside her mouth. She stared into the ghost's endless, empty black eyes. The book slipped from her hand. The book's pages began to flip wildly, symbols blazing with dark energy, as if absorbing the terror flooding the room. In a final attempt to escape, Clara crawled backward, away from it, but it floated after her, laughing loudly, piercingly. Clara's vision dimmed as her strength drained away, her body paralyzed, her mind succumbing to the encroaching darkness. The library stood eerily silent, pale light cast on the dark stone walls. Villagers gathered, whispering to each other as they noticed Clara's absence. The library doors remained shut, and though a few dared to peer through the windows, they saw only empty, silent rooms with no sign of Clara. The whispers lingered, awaiting the next unfortunate soul to uncover the library's secrets. The Curse of the Doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Claw looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Claw, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand. almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll. Seemingly unaware of the curse, she was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. The town's haunted mystery. It was during one of our arguments, moving from yelling to an uncomfortable silence. Kira suggested, almost hesitantly, maybe we just need to leave. Start somewhere new. She stared at the wall, her voice trembling. I thought differently. I didn't believe a change of scenery would solve anything, but despair hung thick in the air between us. We'd gone through endless nonsense for months, arguing over small things like dishes left in the sink or unwashed clothes, which then escalated into intense fights. Our little daughter, Lily, would stand in the corner, clutching her toy, her eyes sad as if she understood more than we realized. The arguments became unbearable, and I felt as though our family was crumbling day by day. The drive to our new town was filled with silence. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow on the horizon as we traded one skyline for endless fields. I cracked the window, breathing in fresh air, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Kira smiled at me, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Eventually, we drove up to our new house. It was a small, cozy old building nestled among others on the street. As we unpacked, I felt a flicker of hope. It was the first time I saw her. Margaret, an elderly woman in a sweater and long skirt, stood on the sidewalk. She waved as she saw us, holding a plate of cookies to welcome us to the neighborhood. As we exchanged pleasantries, I noticed a girl standing behind Margaret, around Lily's age but with a troubling paleness. Then she complimented my daughter. I replied, trying to smile politely, but something about Margaret felt strange. Her enthusiasm was odd. Suddenly, she turned serious, mentioning a certain well. She began to tell me about a wishing well in town, urging me to bring Lily there, assuring me she would love it. A wishing well. I found it rather strange, like a local legend from where I lived. She said it would bring luck to anyone who made a wish and tossed in a coin, a tradition spanning generations. The conversation made me uncomfortable. Kira shrugged, but I felt a chill as I watched Margaret leave, the girl following her like a shadow. In the days that followed, the town felt like a breath of fresh air. The change in atmosphere worked wonders for our family. Kira and I argued less, and Lily seemed to thrive in the open space of our new home. The townsfolk were friendly and laid back. Yet, the well kept coming up in conversation. I overheard a cashier mention it, saying, "The well changed my life." At work, my coworkers talked about it as if it were some sort of miracle. Finally, one night, I mentioned it to Kira, about everyone's obsession with this well. She just thought it was probably one of their local traditions. But the unease grew heavier. The atmosphere at work changed. My hours were cut, and coworkers became distant. It felt like something was pressing down on us, suffocating us. Kira's mood turned dark, and we argued over trivial things again. One night, I was wandering through the forest. I stumbled upon the well. It stood ominously in a clearing, its stone walls oddly slick. I could feel the weight of the town's tradition pulling me back. What if I made a wish? Desperation clawed within me. I approached the well, heart pounding. I had nothing left to lose. I pulled a quarter from my pocket, thinking of my family, of needing things to get better. I tossed the coin in, wishing for things to improve. A silence fell over me as I turned to leave. At that moment, Margaret appeared, her smile wide and unsettling. "You made a wish, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread rising within me. She simply said, "It will come true," and then smiled, walking away. The next morning, I woke up to the familiar warmth in bed. Kira lay beside me, her face peaceful. I glanced around, feeling a weight lift from my chest. I had a strange feeling of hope, as though everything was falling back into place. Breakfast was a cheerful event, laughter filling the room. It felt like the burdens of the past had been lifted. We were happy, almost too happy. But a small part of me felt something wasn't quite right. And everything from that day began that night. While lying in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling of insecurity. Something is wrong. Lily's scream broke the silence, and I rushed to my child's room. Lily trembled, her eyes wide open in fear as she cried and pointed to me that there was a monster in the window. I hurried to the window, pulled back the curtains, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the trees. What is happening? I whispered to myself, feeling panic rise within me. I turned back to Lily, who was still staring at the window, pale and terrified. I stood frozen, trying to comfort her in my arms, though the unease gnawed at me. I stayed up late that night, with Lily between Kira and me. Kira, exhausted from sleepless nights, drifted off, leaving me on high alert. The following days were a chaotic mix of anxiety and paranoia. Lily's nightmares became a nightly occurrence, and each time, I found myself jolted awake by her screams. I tried to distract myself with errands around town, but whispers seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The locals had hollow smiles, with something in their eyes I couldn't quite identify. It felt like the whole town was watching me. "Everything will be fine," a cheerful cashier said as I bought groceries, but her smile felt like a mask hiding something sinister. "Just make a wish by the well." I never wanted this nightmare. I never wanted my family involved in any twisted game. One evening, after another night of Lily's screams, I found myself back at the well, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The air was tense as I approached, Margaret's words echoing in my mind. As I stood there, I noticed the well's surface glistening under the moonlight, almost inviting me. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The chill of the night air made me shiver. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched washed over me once again. I felt a presence lurking in the darkness, and panic took over. I ran home, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. Kira was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I quickly ran to Lily's room to check on her and saw she was fast asleep. But when I looked closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Something wasn't right. I went back to Kira, pacing the floor, my mind spinning. We need to do something. This can't keep happening. Kira's gaze was distant, lost in thought. She said to me, "Maybe we should leave. We could pack up and go somewhere else." "No," I snapped stubbornly, feeling the weight of despair. "We can't keep running. We need to find a way to fix this." That night, I decided to confront Margaret. I needed to know the truth. With my heart racing, I left the house and headed to hers. As I approached, the atmosphere changed. I knocked on the door, fear rising within me. She greeted me with a smile that seemed friendly, but it didn't feel genuine at all. I desperately told her I needed to know what was happening. Her expression turned serious, her eyes narrowing. "You know, wishes come with consequences," she said softly. Leaning closer, "You wished for things to be better, but what if there's a cost?" I felt myself unraveling as she kept talking about what I had lost. She tilted her head, that predatory smile returning. "It's not always clear. Sometimes you get what you wish for by sacrificing something else, something precious." I stumbled back, wondering if I had traded my daughter's happiness for a hollow life. When I returned home, I found Lily in her room, but she wasn't the girl I once knew. Laughter seemed to have been replaced by an eerie silence. She looked at me with hollow eyes, like an empty shell. Regret weighed heavily on me. I had wanted to fix everything, but I had only made it worse, foolishly believing in something dark and twisted. I returned to the well, desperate to undo my wish. I knelt by the edge, staring into the darkness. I want my daughter back. I didn't want this to happen, but the well remained silent. Days passed, and our home became like a prison as Lily worsened, her strange behaviors leaving me helpless and heartbroken, unsure of what to do. Every time I went outside, those around me kept smiling, but their eyes hid a secret, a dark truth I could never grasp. They too had made their wishes, and I was just another pawn in their game. In the end, I made a decision. I would play the game, just like Margaret had. I would find another family and make them wish, too, to replace my daughter. As I walked through the town, I spotted a family moving in down the street, a young couple with a little girl who looked just like Lily. I approached them, a smile spreading across my face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, hiding the darkness within. And no, with a new cast in the pipeline. Maybe the darkness had clouded my vision and taken over. I didn't know when this would end or if there was any escape. The girl looked up, her eyes bright and full of life, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Perhaps I had to be the villain, to save my daughter, my family. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end. Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes, and finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed. The eccentric stalker. It was January, the middle of winter. I had rented a small, isolated cabin by a frozen fishing lake, my perfect hideaway. The cabin was simple, just the essentials, a bed, a fireplace, and a small kitchen. It was enough for someone like me, who only wanted to fish and enjoy the quiet. I planned to stay for 3 days. The first day passed without incident. After settling in, I made myself a cup of hot coffee and relaxed by the fire. The next morning, I woke up at 7 a.m., eager to get to the lake and start fishing. It only took a 10-minute walk through the snow-covered path to reach the lake. The sky was overcast today. When I arrived, I set up my gear, drilled into the thick ice, and started fishing. Hours passed, and I was lost in the moment. But that day, as the wind picked up and the snow began to fall heavier, I decided to pack up and head back to the cabin. That's when I noticed the footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. At first glance, they seemed to be walking alongside me, following the path I had taken from the cabin. From my experience, I knew they were fresh. They stopped at the lake shore, where I had been fishing. And then, they turned back, following my trail toward the cabin. A sense of dread washed over me. Someone had been watching me, but I tried to reassure myself that it might just be another ice fisherman. I walked faster, trying to shake off the creeping fear. Back at the cabin, I bolted the door and threw another log into the fire, trying to warm up and forget about the footprints. I couldn't stop thinking about them, how they appeared so suddenly, how the footprints led straight to the cabin and then veered off into the woods. But as night fell, I heard something. My ears strained. There it was again, a sound unmistakably human footsteps approaching the cabin. I slowly moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back. Through the frost-covered glass, I saw a figure moving outside. They were wrapped in thick winter clothes, head to toe. They got closer, and through the dim light, I could make out an older man, large in size. Panic set in, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The figure on the snow kept moving toward me. I crouched below the window, hoping he wouldn't spot me. I peeked out, barely daring to look. My hand reached for the nearest object, a thick wooden stick, gripping it tightly in case things went wrong. He knocked lightly on the door. The door creaked open, inch by inch. I froze. Oh God, it wasn't locked. I must have forgotten to lock it. The door swung open, revealing the man, his face obscured by a woolen cap, his clothes tattered and worn. He stepped inside, leaving wet, snowy footprints across the wooden floor. Before he came further in, I needed a darker hiding spot. I pressed myself against the wall, behind a large shelf in the darkest corner. I was trying not to make a sound. The man moved slowly, cautiously, as if taking his time to examine everything. On the table was the fish I had caught earlier that afternoon. He sat down, pulled out a knife from his coat, and began slicing into the raw fish. He ate it, greedily, and savored every bite. As I watched him devour the fish, it became clear he wasn't interested in me. In fact, he acted like I wasn't even there. After a while, he leaned back in the chair and lazily wiped his mouth with his hand. He sat there for a moment, then began glancing around the room. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't spot me. But then, satisfied with his meal, he stood up, moving sluggishly as if exhausted, and went straight to my bed. He lay down and was asleep within minutes. I moved quietly, tiptoeing as I carefully grabbed my bag and headed toward the door. Anything I could leave behind, I would. I knew this was my one and only chance. I reached the door and slowly opened it. I ran and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and as I sped away, the cabin shrank in the rearview mirror, fading into the darkness. The eccentric stalker. I never intended to return to that cursed cabin, but fate has a way of pulling you back to places you desperately want to forget. 6 months after that horrifying winter night, I had escaped the isolated cabin by the frozen lake. I thought I had escaped the terror, but the nightmares continued. The image of that man, silently eating the fish I caught and then lying down in my bed as if he owned the place, kept flashing in my mind from time to time. Eventually, the fear subsided, replaced by a desperate need for answers to the questions I had been asking myself. Who was he? Why was he there? And most importantly, what would have happened if I hadn't escaped? This time it was summer, with the snow melted and the lake no longer frozen. I decided to return to the cabin. I convinced myself that daylight would protect me, that the cabin would be less frightening. The journey to the cabin felt as strange as the first time, but now the scenery was lush and green, a stark contrast to the frozen wilderness I remembered. I didn't expect the trip to take so long, and it was already dusk when I arrived, but I had made it. I parked the car and cautiously walked slowly to the front door. The door creaked open, revealing the unchanged interior. A cold fireplace and the bed where that man had slept were still intact. I began searching the cabin, trying to find any sign of the man who had invaded my space months before. The silence here was suffocating, and memories of that haunting night started to flood back. Then I noticed a small leather-bound notebook on the nightstand, peeking out from under the pillow. It hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The leather was worn and cracked, as if it had been used many times over a long period. I opened it to reveal yellowed pages filled with neat, small handwriting. It was a journal. The entries were dated, beginning several years ago, detailing the life of someone who had once lived here. The early entries spoke of peace and joy while fishing at the quiet lake, much like the way I had once enjoyed it. I could imagine such a beautiful scene, but then it changed. He started writing about sketching a scene of a stranger, a figure that would appear at the edge of the lake near a tree, watching him as he fished alone. This stranger, much like the one I had encountered, wore tattered clothes and seemed to survive on whatever he could find to eat. The final entry was dated the winter after I had rented the cabin. It was hastily written, the words barely legible. "He's inside. I can't leave. He won't let me go. I fear this will be the end." I put the journal down, my mind spinning. Was the man trapped by him? What had happened to him? And was he still alive? I realized I needed to leave, right now. As I turned to leave, the cabin door suddenly slammed shut. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing on the wooden floor. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself. I began to regret my curiosity. I backed into the corner, the same corner I had hidden in months before. The shadow gradually revealed itself. Who was it? The man from the journal or someone else? I couldn't be sure, but he seemed more sinister. I pressed myself against the wall, knowing I might have no escape. The man stepped closer. He was very near, and then his eyes met mine. I felt like my life was about to end here. I braced myself for the worst, but then he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out the journal, handing it to me with a trembling hand. I stared at the book, then back at him. His eyes softened, pleading. It was as if he wanted me to take it. I reached out, my hand shaking, and took the journal from him. As soon as it touched my hand, it was like a hallucination. The man's form began to fade, disappearing, leaving only his eyes, glowing with sorrowful despair, before they too vanished. I didn't know what was happening anymore. I stumbled toward the door with the journal in my hand. As I stepped outside, I glanced back one last time. The cabin was silent, empty, but the feeling of being watched was gone. Then the unease returned. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove straight into town, straight to the police station, ready to tell them everything. A week later, the police informed me that the man in the journal was indeed the previous tenant, reported missing months ago. His body has yet to be found. The authorities boarded up the cabin, declaring it unfit for habitation. It was placed in a restricted area. I just hope that, unlike me, no one will return seeking answers. Because you never know, it could be the last day you live. Stranger at the campsite. A woman, Lena, in her 20s, stood at the edge of the familiar trail leading to her campsite. Her hiking backpack was slung over her shoulders, and a neatly rolled-up tent was strapped to it. She breathed in the fresh air, savoring the tranquility of nature. Lena had been camping here for years, escaping the monotony of her small town. The forest was her refuge. Lena moved forward, following the trail leading to the lake. The setting sun filtered through the trees. She felt at home here, but today, a strange unease crept into her chest. As Lena rounded the corner and arrived at the clearing by the lake, her heart skipped a beat. Standing near the water's edge was a man. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing regular swim trunks and a faded white t-shirt. His small tent was already set up, not far from where hers would be. He was staring out across the lake, his back turned to her. Lena hesitated for a moment. She usually camped alone, and seeing someone else here made her feel uneasy. With a slight shrug, she moved a little further from his tent and began setting up her own. She gathered large stones, arranging them into a neat circle to prepare for her campfire later. As she was absorbed in her work, she noticed movement. The man was no longer facing the lake. He was staring directly at her, standing eerily still. Lena's heart raced. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her campfire. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. Her discomfort grew. She awkwardly raised her hand and waved. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he wanted to say hello. But after a moment of silence, the man simply turned and walked along the shore without acknowledging her. Lena frowned. Something about him didn't feel right, but she shook off the thought. She grabbed a chair and sat by the shore, determined to relax and enjoy the view. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Lena packed up her chair and returned to her campsite. She started a campfire, hoping to relax after the strange encounter. As she stared into the flames, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. A figure stood in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was the man in the white shirt. He had returned, standing there, watching from a distance. Lena quickly shifted her chair to the other side of the fire so she could face him. Time passed slowly. The man stood frozen in place as the forest around them grew darker. The shadows deepened, and soon, his figure became blurry, blending into the trees. Even though it was dark, Lena knew he was still there. He could see her clearly, illuminated by the fire, but she could no longer see him. Fear gnawed at her. What was he doing? Why hadn't he returned to his tent? Hours passed, and Lena remained tense, staring into the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and distant crickets. She considered leaving but feared the man might follow her, keeping her rooted in place. She stoked the fire, ensuring it burned brightly, knowing it was her only way to keep the surrounding darkness at bay. Lena sat by the campfire, her face blurred in the flickering firelight. The night was already thick with shadows. The forest around her was a pitch-black void. Her eyes continuously turned to the tree line where the man stood. Even though she could no longer see him, she knew he was still out there, following, waiting. Suddenly, a tree branch broke nearby. Lena stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her camp, squinting into the darkness. Perhaps he has already arrived. The flames cast long, flickering shadows. Lena couldn't stop imagining shapes moving among the trees. There, at the edge of the tree line, someone was probably standing there because she always heard footsteps crunching through the forest. Then slowly, the man's silhouette appeared. She regained her determination, suddenly stood up, picked up a thick branch from the fire, and held it as a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He remained still, watching her as if waiting for her next move. Lena shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling but firm, asking who he was and what he wanted from her. But there was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by her defiance. Lena's skin prickled with fear. She gripped the burning branch tightly and stepped closer to the edge of the campfire, ready to defend herself. But then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest. Slowly, cautiously. His footsteps were eerily soft. Lena watched him go, not daring to follow. He disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. She didn't believe he was truly gone. The night dragged on. Lena struggled to stay alert, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with fear. The fire had burned down, casting only a faint light. Despite her best efforts, her eyes began to droop. She couldn't fight it any longer. After only a short while, Lena was startled awake by a faint sound, her eyes snapping open. The fire was nearly out. Only a few embers remained. The air was cold and damp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had imagined the sound. But then she heard the faint rustling sound again, this time coming from behind the tent. Lena's heart raced. She stood up slowly, creeping carefully to avoid making any noise. She grabbed a nearly burnt-out branch from the fire, gripping it tightly. She cautiously walked around the tent, following the sound. The rustling grew louder as she approached the back of the tent. Lena tightened her grip on the branch. She took a deep breath and rounded the tent, only to find a squirrel nibbling away. The area behind the tent was empty. Lena frowned, confused. She could have sworn she heard something like footsteps. She returned to the fire, scanning the surroundings. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Lena's body was stiff from sitting for hours, her eyes heavy from the sleepless night. It seemed like she was very lucky. For some reason, the man never returned, and she saw no sign of him for hours. But the insecurity is still there. Lena quickly packed her things, wasting no time. She glanced nervously at the tree line. The forest remained quiet and still, as if the events of the previous night had never happened, and she wished that were true. She slung her backpack over her shoulders and began walking briskly toward her car. Her legs trembled. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made her jump, but the trail remained empty. As Lena neared the parking lot, she began to feel a sense of relief. She could see her car up ahead, the only vehicle in sight. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the forest and the strange man behind. But as she reached the clearing, she froze in her tracks. His tent was still there. She slowly, cautiously, walked toward it. The tent flap was slightly open, the inside dark, but there was nothing there. Lena backed away, her mind racing. What kind of game was this? Was he even real? She snapped out of it and hurried toward her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she started the engine, and drove off. As Lena sped down the winding road, she glanced into her rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the man in the white shirt. His hand was raised, thumb out, as if hitchhiking. Lena pressed the gas pedal harder, her car speeding away, and she never looked back or returned to that forest again. It left her with an unforgettable memory, perhaps the worst camping trip she'd ever had. The house of the lost child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying, tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared." They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again, the sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nikki spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nikki stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, the man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Stalked by the clown at the chicken shop. I was working full-time at a chicken shop. Not exactly the job I wanted, but it was enough to get by. Most evenings, I survived on leftover chicken. And then, that Saturday night happened. It had been a long and exhausting day. The restaurant was packed from morning until late at night. As I was cleaning up, my feet aching, I noticed him sitting alone at a table in the corner, waving frantically. At first, I thought he wanted to order, so I walked over, trying to smile. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't a normal customer. He was a mime, grinning widely, dressed in the classic black and white striped outfit, his face painted ghostly white. He didn't say a word. He just performed. I guessed he wanted chicken and fries, so I handed him the food without thinking much about it. I was too tired to care. His expression twisted with irritation the moment I gave him the tray. His grin morphed into a frown. He suddenly stood up and threw a few fake punches into the air like a boxer. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I told him to leave, but his face darkened even more. Slowly, he raised his hand, mimicking the act of pulling something invisible from his back. He stared at me without blinking, slashing the air with the invisible object. I played along, pretending to throw an imaginary stone at him. He staggered back, clutching his head as if I had struck him, then dashed out the door. I laughed at the absurdity of it. I thought it was harmless, but I was wrong. That night, my colleague and I were walking home together. I told him about the mime, and we laughed as we walked. But as we approached the building, I saw something, or rather, someone standing in the shadows of the hallway. A figure, dressed like the mime. I froze, staring, but chalked it up to my tired imagination. A few days later, after another late shift, I stepped outside. I walked home alone, the cold wind biting into my skin. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, not even bothering to change out of my uniform. As soon as my head hit the pillow, the doorbell yanked me out of my restless sleep. Groggily, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the colleague I usually walked home with. He wore his usual green beanie, but stood with his back to the door. I mumbled as I unlocked the door. "Did you forget something again?" But when I opened it, it wasn't him. It was the mime, his face painted ghostly white, grinning at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. He bowed and slipped past me without a word, heading straight for the bag of leftover chicken on my table. I stood there, frozen, as the mime rummaged through the bag. He pulled out a chicken leg, took huge bites, chewing slowly, savoring it like some twisted parody of a meal. Then his eyes lit up. He turned to me, mimicking the act of dipping fries in ketchup, grinning like a madman. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed over, snatched the food from his hand, and yelled at him to leave. His expression darkened. He slowly reached behind his back, pulling out the invisible knife he had shown me earlier. Only this time, it wasn't imaginary. Luckily, I reacted just in time, and it only grazed my arm, leaving a small cut. I bolted out of the room, blood dripping down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster, closer. In my panic, I fumbled with the buttons, desperately pressing the close button as he charged toward me. At the last second, the elevator doors closed. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my vision blurred from pain and fear. The elevator doors finally opened in the lobby, and I staggered out, barely able to stand. My voice trembled as I called for help, and a passerby rushed over, eyes wide with fear. Someone had called 911. When the police arrived, after an hour of investigation, they told me they had searched the building but found no one matching my description, and the security footage had disappeared. He held up an evidence bag. Inside was the knife, but there were no fingerprints. They couldn't find him, but the weapon was proof that it had happened. After that, I moved away and quit my job. I couldn't step foot in that store again. But even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands shaking, and every time I see him in the corner of the room, grinning, holding that bag of chicken, haunting on the midnight train. The town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about, and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
"Jacob."
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
"Jacob, come to me."
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
"You can't escape, Jacob."
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
"Help us. Save us."
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school. But as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something, but there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house, with an axe glinting under the dim porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens, and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor. and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks, his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. Her phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape, Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm. But the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away.